Welcome to Middleweight Politics, political analysis for the independent voter. I am one half of your co-hosting duo, Dan Sally.
I'm Shawn Griffiths.
If you are tired of picking between the lesser of two evils and news presented in either red or blue, you are not alone. And every week we discuss the structural issues driving dysfunction in Washington and what we can do to fix it. Now, this past week, President Trump made his first address to Congress in his second term, which was a grab bag of MAGA goodies, including mentions of fentanyl, pouring over the border, tariffs, and transgender mice. Yes, that actually happened. Now, Democrats, for their part, voiced their protest in a couple of ways. Some openly jeering Trump on the House floor, while others appearing to take the preferred strategy of the Democratic Party lately and not show up. The word unprecedented has been used to describe Trump to the point now where the only thing that would be unprecedented is if he didn't do something unprecedented. But it did feel to many like last week's speech crossed into new territory. But did it? Or have we seen this before? We're going to talk about what history says in this episode, and also what history says about a potential Democratic resistance to Trump. But first, so Shawn, it is Friday, March 7th, 12:09 p.m. Eastern Time. So this is typically when we record our episodes. We drop them on Monday, of course. And what we learned last week is that we really need to check the president's calendar before we record. Because, of course, after we recorded our conversation, which I thought was very good, President Trump met with Zelensky. Things did not go as planned for at least one of them. Trump and Zelensky got into a bit of an argument. J.D. Vance stepped up to defend Trump's honor, and Marco Rubio attempted to blend in with the couch. He actually had, he had that look on his face that my dog gives me when I catch him laying on my bed. A lot I could say about this. What are your thoughts?
Well, and here's the thing. We could keep track of the president's schedule, but the thing with this administration is that breaking news is always going to be right around the corner, and then it's going to take an immediate left turn, right? And we're going to continue to see this down the line. And I think the one general consensus among both Trump supporters and Ukraine supporters is shock. We saw shock with our allies around the world. And so immediately after, you saw both the UK and France come out and pledge additional money and additional military assets to help Ukraine out, to which J.D. Vance responded, calling the UK a random small country, which is very wild, to say the least.
Yeah, a random small country that the United States was once part of. But go on, sorry.
Right. And then later that week, the EU, the European Union, announces a commitment of 800 billion euros to enhancing the continent's defense. And so that is a clear message to the world and to America that our European partners are preparing a world order in which America is not at the center anymore.
I think it's clear from last week, not just from the speech we heard, but also from that meeting with Zelensky, that the world is no longer the same. I think there was a sense in Trump's first term that his more disruptive impulses, shall we say, would be contained by cooler heads in Washington, and the order as we know it would more or less stay the same. I think that's gone now. I think that's gone. And I don't think it's a terrible thing. I think one thing I've always believed, and this is both for the U.S. government, but also for the way we conduct international affairs, is that centralized power is never a good thing. And I think the last 20 years make a very strong argument against too much military power being concentrated in the hands of the United States. The Iraq War being, the chief example. So I don't think it's a bad thing that Europe is taking ownership of its own defense. And to be frank, I think right now, when we look at the state of modern democracy, Europe offers the most stability.
Yeah, I think because of the perception of American exceptionalism, we often forget how strong those countries are in Europe, how strong their economies can be, how strong their democracies are. And so I think in the next few years and even in beyond that, we are going to see a lot of these European countries step up and show that, the world isn't as dependent on America as people like Trump want the world to think.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the funniest things to happen out of all this is, Putin's a big student of history. Putin really views his own actions in the context of a much longer Russian history. And I think what's so interesting is that he never saw Germany rearming itself coming
Hmm.
and didn't really think, hey, maybe that's not the best idea. Yeah, so I can't imagine he's really happy about that. But moving on to the next piece of shocking breaking news, we had Trump's speech before Congress on Tuesday. Highly partisan. Did you watch it? It's in its entirety, Shawn.
I watched probably about an hour of it,
Yeah,
and then it seemed to be like just the same stuff, just long winded.
yeah. I made it an hour too, and I think I got the gist. Um, Unusual in modern history. Very much like a stump speech. Very partisan. I can't recall a president standing before Congress and being critical of a former president before. And I don't want to both sides this, but like, what are the Democrats doing? Like, really?
Right. So, I mean, just a week ago, we talked about how much focus the Democratic Party puts on institutional homogeny. And so this week, it was kind of a surprise to see how ununiformed they were in the State of the Union address. Some of them are wearing t shirts, some of them are holding up these weird auction paddles, and then some of them walked out. Like there was no, it didn't seem like there was any plan or uniform consensus on what resistance should look like.
Yeah, I'd agree there. And the other thing is, it's sort of like, what are you resisting? I mean, I
Hmm.
get it. Like, I get you don't like Trump's agenda, and I get you don't like Trump, and that's fine,
Right.
but he's the president. The people who were going to resist and vote against Trump voted in November, and he
Hmm.
won.
Yeah.
So you got to move on. You got to offer something different. And I think the interesting thing is there's such a huge opening here because while Trump is talking about like taking back the Panama Canal and annexing Greenland and making sure that the right genders use the right bathrooms, there's no talk about the economy.
Hmm.
I mean, this week the stock market has been tanking. Inflation is showing no signs of abating. More jobs were cut last month than in any February since 2009. Okay, there is a wide opening. There is a green field. Show us your economic plan.
Yeah.
But instead, it's resist Trump.
Yeah. It's clear to Trump that the ball is clearly on his side of the court right now, and that he kind of has the Democrats where he wants them. Because even during the speech, he said, it doesn't matter what I would say up here. I could have cured some nation, destroying disease, and you still would just sit there and not clap for it. I mean,
Yes.
he called out the very partisan nature of our system in a way that no other president has. And in following the speech, he told Republicans through True Social that, hey, because of how the Democrats acted, they're going to lose in the midterms. And I'm kind of thinking right now, unless the Democrats think of a unified, better way to resist Trump, that he's right.
Yeah.
Because what Americans want now is for their elected officials to cooperate, to work together, to address their needs and interests, which right now is the economy. And not only are they not seeing that, but they're seeing one half of our government saying, absolutely, we're not going to work with you. We're just going to boo you and just sit there and do nothing.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, he was right in the sense that he could shoot someone in the middle of Fifth Avenue and he wouldn't lose a supporter. And he could also raise that person back from the dead and it wouldn't sway one of his detractors.
Hmm.
So I think people's opinions of Trump are pretty calcified at this point. Now, getting to what you said about how to resist Trump, I actually went back and tried to figure out where is the historical parallel to this, if there is one, right? And I specifically honed in on eras of political realignment. And so if you're listening and you're unfamiliar with the concept, America's two major parties have been formed of different coalitions over the years. So, for example, back during the Reconstruction era, the black vote was almost entirely Republican because Republicans were on the anti slavery side of the Civil War, obviously. That changed in the late 60s when Democrats became the party of civil rights. And that's just one example. We're seeing a realignment right now where blue collar voters, traditionally Democratic, have switched Republican. And so I think it's fair to look at those periods and say, okay, are there examples of somebody acting similarly, first and foremost? What does that mean? What's the legacy? And also, what did the resistance look like? What did the opposition do? And how does that paint a picture for what things might look like in the future? The one I landed on that's the most interesting was Andrew Jackson,
Hmm.
which I don't know how familiar you are with Jackson at all.
So I have some historical recollection of Jackson and what he was like as a president, and I agree with you that if you were to look at a historical parallel between Trump and any of our presidents in history, that Jackson is probably the best choice.
Yeah, agreed. And just to bring the listener up to speed, you know, Jackson, like Trump, was a very populist figure, really ran on appealing to the quote unquote common man. He was accused of executive overreach. They actually referred to him as King Andrew. Also, survived an assassination attempt. Now, this is interesting. Do you know this story or no?
I am vaguely familiar with this
Okay.
story. Yes.
So, Jackson is walking out of a funeral at the US Capitol, and his assassin creeps up on him as he's walking out, takes a shot at him, and his gun doesn't work, right? So then he takes another gun out and tries to shoot him, and that gun doesn't work. And then Andrew Jackson walks over and beats him with his cane. Like, you could take that little boo-boo on your ear and suck it, Trump, because, like, Jackson beat that dude like a dog. Another interesting one. You know who helped him beat this guy up?
Who was that?
Davy Crockett. Davy Crockett. Can you imagine? I just have this image of, like, Jackson with his cane and Crockett there with his coonskin hat on, just like getting this guy in like a rear naked choke. So at any rate, there's a little piece of American lore. That out of the way, Jackson's presidency comes after what was known as the era of good feelings, which was a period more or less of one party rule. So when Jackson came onto the scene, there was no real meaningful opposition. And so what ended up happening is a group of very ideologically inconsistent factions got together and formed the Whig Party, which was strictly there to oppose Jackson. And if we look today, the Democrats are kind of the Whigs, right?
Oh, I was going to say, in a way, yes, the Democratic parties are in that position of being the Whigs of the modern era. Except the difference is that you didn't see the Democratic Party form from this kind of all collective.
True. So I think the big question here is, what does that era tell us about how this all might play out? And there are a couple of things that come to mind. If we look at Jackson or we look at other populist movements more broadly, what we see are movements largely led by one singular personality. And when that personality disappears, one of two things happen. One is that personality's platform gets absorbed, or elements of it get absorbed into one of the two major parties. The other is that it just totally fizzles out.
Mm-hmm.
And I think the jury is still out on which way that's going to go. I think one thing I would say is that the underlying issues that have driven Trump's support haven't gone away. And even if Trump accomplishes everything he wants to do in his 4 years, they won't go away when he's gone.
I think it's fair to come to the assessment that the jury is still out on what actually happens to the MAGA movement when
Mm-hmm.
Trump can no longer run for president and is no longer with us. I think when you look at the signs and the flags and all that, they are very Trump centric. So it's easy to see how MAGA could fizzle out. But then that leaves the question, what happens to the Republican Party? And I think this is where we're going to see perhaps a political realignment in this country that we've never seen before. Because right now we exist in a system that benefits and serves two major political parties, the Republican and Democratic Party. There's very little room for a party to emerge and take it over
Mm-hmm.
completely.
Yeah.
And so either you're going to see these ideological grassroots movements emerge from the party and take it over from the inside, which we've seen from the Republican side, or you're going to see that movement die out, as we've seen with some more progressive movements that have tried to do the same in the Democratic Party.
Yeah. One of the things that popped in my feed yesterday was an article in the Bulwark published by Lee Drutman, who's a political scientist, big promoter of proportional representation, and Michael Bailey, professor of government at Georgetown University. The article was entitled Democrats Must Step Aside in Red States. And what they said is that the Democratic brand is so toxic in red states that it really doesn't make any sense to run anybody at all. And an example they gave was a guy by the name of Lucas Kuntz, who ran against Josh Hawley for Senate in Missouri. He was a Marine veteran, kind of fashioned himself as this Fetterman style centrist. He only outperformed Harris by 2 points in Missouri. Okay.
Mm.
Now, if you go to Nebraska, there's another guy by the name of Dan Osborne, independent, ran against their incumbent Republican Senator, Deb Fischer, under almost the same platform, outperformed Harris by 8 points and also managed to woo 12% of Trump voters over to his side. So, what it tells us is that when you don't attach a D next to somebody's name, the policies actually sell and sell better. And so, the argument that Drutman and Bailey make is that if the Democrats were to leave, some other group would come in to fill the vacuum. And I think if you look, there are enough Republicans who are either uncomfortable with Trump or enough Republicans who've just been ostracized from the party to form some sort of conservative alternative. So, again, for those of us who want maybe lower taxes, maybe want smaller government, but like also want to get our measles shots and don't want to leave the purse strings of government in the hands of some, billionaire with Adderall fueled visions of sending us all to Mars, I think that might be a good option.
I think when you look at our history, and we talked about this already, how when personalities like Trump come to power, it is during a time of political realignment, and I would say that this comes at a time where not only is political alignment likely, but it's much needed in our country. We discussed this in the last episode about how both parties are just out of touch with the American people at this point. Either one side is not speaking to the issues at all that Americans care about, or the other side is trying to distract them with other issues while not actually getting to the practical solutions that Americans want to see. And so we already saw in this last election that simply building some sort of coalition that is anti Trump specifically is not going to work in the same way that it worked for the Whigs when it came to Jackson, and how the Whigs were able to come into relevancy in American politics. We saw Liz Cheney, we saw all these other Republicans, these anti Trump Republicans, come out and endorse Kamala Harris. She still lost.
Mm-hmm.
So clearly, any coalition that's built in any sort of political realignment in this country cannot be built from anti-Trump sentiment. It has to be come from a place where the people involved are genuinely sincere, and when they speak to the American people, that they are out for practical solutions.
Yeah. Well, I think, too, to kind of build on that point here, one of the things we said at the very beginning of this episode is how it's clear that after this week, the world has changed,
Mhm.
right? Trump's speech definitely showed us that we're in yet again, a new era of American politics. Europe's actions and Trump's meeting with Zelensky show us we are in a new era of international politics. And getting back to what we said earlier, I think the political pull and tug so far has been, let's get rid of Trump so we can go back to normal.
Mhm.
And there's no normal.
Right.
And I think to add on top of that too, I think that if we were to go back to normal, that would ignore the historical moment we're in, which is that the US is not unique in the fact that there are populations that have been ill served by the last 30 years of economic integration. It's
Right.
not just the US. It exists in Great Britain. It exists in Germany to a lesser extent. And I think that what you see globally is you see these traditional establishment center left and center right parties losing ground to more extreme alternatives. And if we were just to say, oh, you know what? We'll just get rid of Trump and MAGA and turn the Wayback Machine and it'll be right back to where it was, I don't know, whenever. Like it'll be right back to where it was before. It's not going to happen. And I think whatever coalition emerges from this, if they're going to be successful, can't just oppose Trump and oppose MAGA. It has to provide a meaningful alternative to the people who are the most hurt and the most angry.
Yeah, and I'm open to that idea of it, not just Democrats in red states, but even like Republicans in solidly blue states. This idea that the party should step aside and allow for broader coalition if they really want to get things done and see things accomplished within their own states. The issue, though, is that one, it feels like you're going to alienate the voters who are still very much supportive of either party, whichever party they're a member of. But also, from my view, the party would have to go completely dark for this to happen, because we saw it with Dan Osborne in Nebraska. We saw it with candidates like Greg Orman in Kansas when he ran for Senate in 2014, and then later in governor. When you're an independent and you're running only against another major party, that major party will accuse you of being secret agents for the opposing party.
Yeah, that's the point. So that's the point Drutman made.
Hmm.
And Drutman is actually a very big fan of organized parties. And part of the reason is so you can communicate policies. And the advice given in this article is that a party form. So not an independent, but a true dyed in the wool conservative alternative. That's sort of his recommendation. Because I do think you're right. Any independent is automatically going to be branded as a spoiler.
Right.
And to an extent, not taken seriously either,
Hmm.
for better or for worse.
I do agree. I think if this type of political realignment did happen, it cannot be on the back of independent candidates specifically. Certainly, there is room for success for independent candidates, but the thing with independent candidates is that you never really know where they stand on particular issues. So, being part of a institutional structure that says we are an open tent for broad, pragmatic solutions to our nation's biggest needs will be far more effective, I think, than running as an independent.
Yeah, yeah, and of course, we can't let this conversation go on without saying that if there were ranked choice voting, we wouldn't have to worry about the spoiler effect, and this argument would never occur, and people would just be able to vote for their favorite first choice. But we don't, and we are going to leave it there, Shawn. Thank you very much for listening. If you liked what you heard today, Shawn and I have a very simple request. Now, most Americans are stuck in the crossfire between warring political extremes. And our goal with this podcast is to take that frustrated majority and turn it into a force for real political reform. And if this sounds like you, there are a few ways you can help us out. Number one, subscribe to the podcast, share it with others who are tired of the same old Team Red versus Team Blue game, and take a moment to rate us and review us. The more people we get into this conversation, the bigger of an impact we can make. The music you are hearing is courtesy of the nonpartisan U.S. Coast Guard Band. Thank you very much for listening to Middleweight Politics, and stay purple.